So I currently work at Public Health England in Porton Down in Salisbury. I'm part of the Biosafety Investigation Unit, which has since been renamed since I made this presentation, but that'll do. And one of our specialities is dealing with biological incidents. We have a bio-response department which can respond with the appropriate equipment and sampling to deal with principally anything that may be bioterrorism related. Anthrax is the main one that keeps people busy nowadays. So I'm going to give you a bit of a talk on my experience in Sierra Leone, what exactly PHE did out there, why we responded in the first place, how we established our diagnostic capabilities, then some experiences from my first deployment in November, December 2014, and then some from July and August 2015. And I'll touch on what I think the future holds in terms of Ebola in West Africa. So as you're probably all aware, this is the largest Ebola outbreak in history. There have been 30,000 cases and 11,000 deaths, and that's across 7 affected countries. It's worth stating that that is probably a significant underestimate, maybe 70% underestimated. There are a lot of cases that have gone unnoticed, and I'm sure when the epidemiologists and the scientists that are currently out there start to collate all the data properly, we'll start to see these figures rise quite significantly. As you can see, the bulk of disease occurred in 3 principal countries, in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea. Here's a map of the most affected area here, and it shows you the total number of cases colour-coded there, the key on the left-hand side. This data is accurate as of 18th of November. Since then, things have moved on. Sierra Leone is, of course, at the moment Ebola-free, but there have been 3 new cases in Liberia in the last week or so. And I'll touch on that later because I think it's going to be a continuing problem for a good few months, possibly even years to come. We think the outbreak started, there's good evidence to suggest it started in December 2013 in a region in Gekadu in Guinea, which is around about here. So you can see that it's very close to the border of Sierra Leone, very close to the border of Liberia. It is thought to have originated in a 18-month-old boy who may or may not have contracted it from bats playing near a tree. We've got good sequencing data now, so genomic sequencing data, to show how it spread from Gekadu, principally via a funeral event, which was the funeral of a very popular traditional healer. Her funeral was attended by several hundred people, and as part of the funeral process they washed the body, so they have intimate contact with the body, and that appears to have infected a large number of people who then travelled back to their respective regions in Guinea, Sierra Leone and Liberia, because these borders are very porous. Most of the native people who live here don't recognise this as a border. They just live across both countries. So they went back to their respective countries and then passed it into the capital cities, which is really where the problem started. And there's very good evidence now to suggest that it came from Guinea, it went into Sierra Leone, developed in Sierra Leone, and then Sierra Leone reintroduced it back into Guinea. So it's a very complex transmission chain. The outbreak peaked in November and December of 2014. We can see from this graph here, along the bottom we have weeks of the year, 2014 here, 2015 here, and we can see a large peak in cases for Sierra Leone and Guinea. This is Sierra Leone here and Guinea below in the darker blue, around about November, December, reaching a peak of more than 500 cases per week. Very significant number of cases. And this is, of course, only the number of confirmed cases, so those that we have diagnosed with laboratory capabilities. There's a whole host of probable and suspected cases that fall in here somewhere, so this number again is likely to be significantly higher. And it's in November 2014 that I first deployed to Sierra Leone. So Public Health England were asked by the Department for International Development, the UK government, to establish 3 semi-permanent diagnostic laboratories in Sierra Leone to augment the testing capability. And these were established in Port Loko, in Makeni, and in Kerrytown, which sits on the Western Peninsula south of the capital, Freetown. Now, I was deployed to the Port Loko laboratory, which would receive samples from approximately this geographical area. So it covers quite a large area. Particular importance is this region up here, which borders Guinea. So there's a lot of free movement across here. So there's a lot of cases from Guinea coming into Sierra Leone and vice versa. So PHE wanted to establish permanent, semi-permanent laboratories in well-built treatment centres. And this is in contrast to some of my colleagues who deployed with the European Mobile Laboratory, and this is a consortia of European diagnostic laboratories. And they have quite a unique principle, and that is that they can carry an entire laboratory in 23 suitcases, weighing less than 400 kilograms, so they can carry it all on one flight, a commercial flight, and they can set that laboratory up wherever they may land in the world. And these boxes contain what we call flexible isolators, or collapsible glove boxes, and they look like this. Here we have a glove port here where you can stick your hand in and one the other side, and these are essentially powered by a car battery, so they can be used in the field, and they provide a safe environment for which you can manipulate your virus samples, so a physical barrier between yourself and the sample. And this is quite a unique concept. So a few of my colleagues deployed. The European Mobile Laboratory were the first laboratories out to West Africa, principally serving Liberia and Guinea, and later in Christmas 2014 they moved a laboratory to Sierra Leone because we needed more capability there. So before any of us deployed with Public Health England, we had to undergo quite extensive training at Porton Down, and we're very lucky because we have a dedicated novel and dangerous pathogens training department, and as the name would suggest, they specialise in bespoke courses involving safe handling of novel and dangerous pathogens. So what we actually did was built a like-for-like scale mock-up of the Kerrytown laboratory on the site in Porton, so that all the volunteers could train in a real environment under real conditions. And this training involved several scenarios, for instance power failure, because we anticipated the power supplies would be particularly bad. There's a lot of surging, there's a lot of power cuts. All our power would come from generators, so if those generators weren't topped up with diesel, we'd lose the power. And another scenario involved ramping up the temperature in the laboratory to simulate an air conditioning failure. We were lucky insofar as the laboratories were air conditioned, but should we lose the air conditioning, should we lose power and still have a requirement to work, then we needed to know what it felt like to work under 30-degree heat. So that was a very interesting experience. And I'd just like to give praise to this novel and dangerous pathogens training team, because essentially they gave up their day jobs and they ran 29 one-week courses between October 2014 and November 2015 to train everybody deploying with Public Health England, no matter what your level of experience. There were plenty of people who had deployed that had handled Ebola before, but we had to ensure that everybody was up to the same standard so that everybody was working safely in quite a challenging environment. So I deployed mid-November 2014 on a flight Heathrow to Brussels and then Brussels to Freetown via Guinea and Senegal. It was therefore quite a long flight. We arrived late in the evening to a very hectic Freetown airport. The first thing we were confronted with is men wearing masks and gloves. Lots of chlorine hand wash stations. We weren't allowed into the airport until we'd washed our hands. Lots of people inside doing all sorts of health surveys, wanting to take your bags, wanting to give you a ride on the ferry over to Freetown, much like a cattle market. But eventually we found where we were going, hopped in a car, got 20 miles down the road and realised we'd left someone behind, which was never a good start. So we had to turn all the way back again. A very good experience. And then we arrived to something that looked like this. And we had no idea what kind of accommodation we would be staying in. We had very little information up front because we were the first team out to Port Loko. We'd had very little contact with the charity that we were deploying with that would be providing care for us whilst we were there. And then, yes, oh boy, it was camping. We were semi-led to believe that we'd actually be staying in some guest house accommodation which was close to the site, but unfortunately it wasn't to be. So one good thing is that swiftly after arriving we all became millionaires. And here's me counting several 100,000 leones, the local currency. And here's an image I borrowed from one of my colleagues of the wedge of cash that he was given on arrival in Guinea. The downside being it's probably the only time, well, it's the only time I'll be a millionaire, but it's the only time I'll be a millionaire where I don't actually want to handle the money. It's it is particularly grubby. It's been circulating for a long time. It's very dirty. It stains your hands. It makes your hands smell. So really this drove home the need for good hand hygiene very early on, which, was a blessing actually, because that was key to preventing, not only Ebola, but all the other bacteria and pathogens that we'd encounter in the field that would be more of a risk. So this is an overview of the camp that I was staying at. When we first arrived, the camp had only been there for 1 day, so there was essentially only an accommodation tent and the mess tent. Now the camp was provided by the International Health Partnership, or IHP, which is a consortium of mainly Nordic countries that provide funding and capability to establish these sort of camps to support aid workers principally in disaster zones. This was quite unprecedented for such a large disease. This camp was run by the Danish Emergency Management Agency, or DEMA. There we go, that's the sign explaining that. Actually, it wasn't too bad. The tents were air conditioned, which was a very nice blessing. We had lighting. These are lights that kept the camp illuminated at night, mainly for security reasons. It made sleeping slightly difficult. We had electricity supply. Just over here you see some generators. And this is what our accommodation was like. We were in 6-man tents, and we had a little berth each with this privacy screen here. Of course, we had to put up mosquito nets. That is not a particularly good mosquito net, I hasten to add. If I were in it, that would be tucked under. The risk for mosquitoes was relatively low because we were in an air-conditioned tent, but you didn't really want to take the risk. In my second deployment, I had 3 people come down with malaria, so it really was a real risk, even if you were taking medication. We had a mess tent, which is where we congregated for most of the day in some instances. When we first arrived, because of because of the situation in terms of weather and the fact that the treatment centre wasn't quite built yet, we had a lot of hanging around to do. So we spent a lot of our time in the mess tent, essentially talking. We didn't have much else to do. Towards the end, they built an outside gazebo area that had some comfortable chairs that we could go in and relax in outside, which was a bit more enjoyable. Not so much in the evening, actually, because the amount of insects would be attracted towards the lights. So the camp was essentially evolving for the entire 5 weeks that we were there. It still wasn't finished by the time we left. And whilst we were there was a distinct lack of luxuries. For 4 weeks, we had no toilets. So everything had to be done in a bag, which is an experience. And here's a tweet of myself. I didn't realize this was actually done, but this got sent out by DEMA. This is me receiving instructions on how to do my business in the bag. And doing this in a tent in 38-degree heat and 95% humidity is not a very pleasant experience at all. Most of us spent most of the time wet through perspiration, which also presented quite a difficult problem drying clothes because of the humidity. You simply couldn't dry clothes. So I know a number of colleagues whose clothes actually rotted. Thankfully, we weren't too bad because they actually installed a laundry service on site with tumble dryers, which was no toilets but tumble dryers. It's quite odd. We had no running water for about 2 weeks. DEMA established a borehole with reverse osmosis treatment, but we had a significant issue in keeping that clean from the treatment centre up to the point of use. They were very well organised and they had the capability to test for indicator bacteria such as E. coli in the water supply. And me, principally being a water microbiologist, I took on that task and unfortunately started finding it everywhere, which meant the water wasn't safe to consume. So it just goes to show that maintaining safe hygiene in the field is actually quite difficult. So we resorted to bottled water, and there were about 50 of us on camp at this stage, and that's a lot of bottled water to keep us going in those conditions. So it was an entire, what we call a reefer, so a big shipping container full of water. And of course each water bottle is waste, and that's got to be dealt with. So a significant amount of waste that was generated. All the biological waste was burnt on site in either burn pits or incinerators. We had no internet, which wasn't a big issue to begin with until colleagues at home tried starting to send information through on the treatment centre via email, which wasn't particularly great. We did eventually get a satellite internet connection established, but it wasn't particularly good, but it was enough to enable us to contact home. We only had our personal mobile phones with us, and you were looking at, I think it was about £2 per minute phone call rate. So not many people could maintain that to phone home for any period of time. Of course, before we deployed, we were all told, it's okay, Sierra Leone runs off a 3-pin system. So none of us bought adapters. And then, of course, we were staying in a Danish camp. So it was all 2-pin electricity supply, and none of us had adapters. Miraculously, they managed to source some in country. I still don't know how they did it. But we spent a week without any electronics. And given the fact that we had little to do in that first week, having no electronics and no means of entertainment was quite of a shock, actually. It just goes to show how much we rely on our modern technology. This is quite an amusing event that occurred one night. It was quite incredible, actually. Out of nowhere, at about 8 p.m., the place started filling with thousands and thousands of flies. It's like they've just gone into some sort of breeding mode, or will all come to die somewhere. But this is my colleague, Bruno, who's shielding his dinner. You can't see the flies because they're so small, but there's literally hundreds and hundreds. And if you look at this image here, I gave up eating halfway through because I just couldn't guarantee that I wasn't going to eat a few hundred flies. But all these specks are flies. No idea where they came from, but if you stepped outside, all the tents were covered in flies. Millions and millions of them. And it was just for one night only. They'd all come, they'd all died, and that was it. I don't know what it is. I'm not an expert in flies, but it was a very disturbing evening. But other wildlife, it was quite fantastic, actually. We had a number of chameleons around camp. This guy here is called Daniel. He was the camp medic, and he made it his task to send the locals out to collect chameleons. He would then take them in and release them into the trees around the camp as a means of biological control, because we had a lot of crickets. I don't actually think it made any difference whatsoever, but it kept the locals amused for a short time. These wonderful moths here, I forget their name, but they're twin-tailed and they have a spiral on the end of the tail, and they actually fly in spirals. And these were everywhere, particularly in the shower tents in the morning. You can be guaranteed you'll be sharing it with at least 30 different insects of various different types, which is a problem for some people. And of course, slightly alarming in some instances, there were a number of scorpions within the camp. Again, Daniel made it his task to actually collect the scorpions and kept them in jars in some sort of morbid insect farm that he had inside one of his tents. This necessitated the need to check your boots every morning. You did not want to be stepping on an emperor scorpion. Snakes were a bit of an issue as well. There are a number of poisonous snakes in West Africa. Green mambas are a bit of an issue. Typically they tend to stay away from human activity. We had a number of baby snakes that came onto camp. Thankfully, the local workers who were employed to help build the camp could spot these quite easily and swiftly dealt with them with a spade. But it just brought home that there was danger lurking around the corner if you weren't too careful, which is another reason why we had lights on at night around the camp. The weather, Climb's already mentioned that it was very hot and very humid, and that was true. And we thought we were going into the dry season, but luckily for us, the wet season was unusually long that year. And this just shows an image of one of the downpours. I've got a video shortly. But it necessitated digging drainage ditches all through the camp, because you can see it suddenly becomes a quagmire. So we've got to deal with this large volume of water. So all these drainage ditches crisscrossing the camp out to another field. I don't know who owned the other field, but it all drained into his field. I don't think they ever had any complaints. So here we see one of the drainage ditches full. It would take maybe 10 minutes before these started flowing through the camp. And of course, this significantly hampered our ability to set up both the treatment centre and the diagnostic laboratory. This is what the site looked like after a downpour. This is a few of my team trying to cross the mud. luckily, we'd all packed for all eventualities, so we all had good boots and footwear. But you can see you can't really build a treatment centre in this kind of weather. You can't lay concrete. You can't put up tents. Unfortunately, one of the workers was struck by lightning whilst working on one of the tents and unfortunately died. So it was really quite severe weather. This is the kitchen tent during the night. You see the sheer volume of water has actually caused the tent, which is an inflated tent, it's held up by air essentially, to collapse. So a huge volume of water that's coming down on these things. And hopefully this will work, just to give you an idea. Oh, not that. The sheer volume of rain that comes down. This is absolutely horrid. There's no way you can work in these conditions. You can see all the drainage ditches that we had to dig and all the water pooling. This was after probably about 10 minutes. And shortly after I filmed this, I really wish I kept filming, but there was a lightning strike just off left to the camera here, about 100 yards away from the camp. We were next to an old school building. It was an old university technical college that was opened by Queen Elizabeth back in the 60s. Very famous place, actually, is one of the best universities in West Africa when it was actually up and running. And the lightning struck the top of a building there, and it's the loudest and scariest thing I've ever experienced. First, I didn't know what it was until the blinding flash. But it just brought home that we were living in really bad weather conditions. In terms of transport, Sierra Leone is not too bad, actually. The Chinese built quite a decent road network a few years ago. Connects the main cities. There are only a few roads, and they don't exactly take the logical route, so it does take quite a few hours to get between places, but the roads generally are very good condition. The locals tend to get around however they can. A lot of them don't have cars. They'll just hop on the back of lorries, they'll hop on the back of trucks, stacked on top of the wood here. We've seen people riding in open boots, lying on top of cars, sitting on the front of the bonnets, all sorts of weird things. And road traffic accidents are very common in Sierra Leone, unsurprisingly. We came across a number. My colleague in Guinea was involved in a collision with a motorcycle where unfortunately 2 people died. So the roads may look okay, but they can be quite treacherous. Fortunately, I did not have to deal with a situation like this. And these are images that I've taken from my colleague who was in Guinea, and he had to go on about a 2-day journey to the laboratory from the airport through conditions like this. Luckily the 4x4s could make it, but these trucks here have been stuck for days. And you literally have to wait until the conditions improve and the mud dries out before you can try and get out. So the roads are scattered with all these broken down vehicles that are essentially stuck. So I did not envy this at all. Some of the guys flew by UN helicopter or by plane, and the unfortunate ones had to trek about 2 days. So not a pleasant experience. And you're always hampered by roadblocks or checkpoints. And these are set up essentially to restrict the movement of locals during particular hours. Whilst I was there, there was a curfew so that after 5 o'clock you were not allowed to move about. You had to go home. During the day, the army manned these checkpoints, which are essentially just some sticks and a rope across the road, and they stop your vehicle. They ask where you're going, they ask for your pass to say that you are allowed to move about, and then they check your temperature. And that's a means of making sure you're not travelling around the country with a fever. The only problem being is that none of them are quite trained in order to use the temperature probes. None of the probes are calibrated. So it was frequent to have a temperature of about 34, 33. They thought that was fine and let you go. And they don't know any better because they're not trained, they're not educated to that level. So it really was a bit of an issue. It was very concerning because if you did have a fever by the thermometer, which you probably didn't because you typically know when you have a fever, you'd be taken out in the vehicle and put in a tent on the side of the road where potentially other people with fever who may have Ebola reside. Thankfully that didn't happen, but it was always a concern. And these checkpoints were probably every 5 or 6 miles along the roads. So if you were making a 60-mile journey, you'd have to pass through 9 or 10 of these. Sometimes they were manned by people who weren't in army uniform, who were wearing caps that had police written on it, so you were never quite sure who was actually stopping you, which was slightly concerning. But actually, we never had a bad experience, thankfully. So I'm going to move on to describe what work we were actually there to do, what we actually conducted, and I'll start by explaining what an Ebola treatment centre actually is. And this is a plan of the Department for International Development Kerrytown Treatment Unit, which differs slightly from the other two laboratories, other two treatment centres that they established, insofar as it was built with a dedicated unit for healthcare workers. So these would be Western healthcare workers who are suspected or indeed did have Ebola through their work. They would be treated here before medevac to the UK or another European country. So Ebola treatment centres are based on a white zone, a green zone and a red zone principle. And these colours here have nothing to do with that. Basically, the white zone is all the administration tents, the safe area where you can walk around without any personal protective equipment, where you would expect there to be no Ebola whatsoever. So a nice, clean environment. And then you have what you call the green zone, which is essentially the buffer zone between you and the positive patients. So that's where our laboratory was located here. There's the doctor's office. There's various other tents and units over here. And this is where you would change into your scrubs, you'd change into your boots, you'd maintain hand hygiene, boot hygiene. The chances of Ebola being there is very slim, but you take the precaution just in case there was. And then you have the red zone, and the red zone is essentially this area marked by orange here, which is where all the suspected, the probable and the confirmed cases of Ebola would be dealt with. So patients would enter at this end here through the ambulance. If they were well enough, they'd be waiting in the waiting area. They'd have their blood, they'd be triaged. They'd have their blood taken, which will be delivered to the laboratory via this walkway here. And then they'd be moved to various areas depending on our test results. So if they remain suspected, they'd be moved to suspected. If they were confirmed, they'd be moved to confirmed over here. And at the end here, we have the morgue and or decontamination units or discharge showers, depending whether the patient recovered or not. This is an aerial view of that treatment centre, just to show you how isolated it is. Deliberately designed so that it's away from major population centres. It is essentially a self-contained hospital designed to keep Ebola in. So the nearest big town was about 6 or 7 miles that way. And out this way was nothing but coastline and accommodation where the workers about 20 miles that way. I've just got a video here of a drone flying over that particular site. So we have the ambulance bay here, as I pointed out, and the red zone runs all the way along here. And we would enter through here into the green zone, which starts here. And our laboratory is that building there. And that's the walkway through which the samples would come. And down here we have the treatment unit for healthcare workers. And this was run by the Ministry of Defence. So it was manned by Navy, by Army, by Marines and by RAF medical staff. And that is the facility through which all the UK confirmed cases were treated before being sent back to the UK. So Pauline Kafke, for instance, transited through this facility. She actually worked at this treatment centre itself. This is what we were greeted with when we arrived at our treatment centre. We were led to believe it would be completed by the time we arrived. We were rather naive. The weather, of course, had hampered efforts quite significantly. And this was what our laboratory looked like, which was actually an improvement because when the Kerrytown team first arrived, they had foundations only. We at least had 4 walls and a roof. But as you can see, we had no equipment yet. We didn't have a power supply. One thing to note is whoever spec'd these labs out obviously thought we had a lot more electrical equipment than we needed, because each one of these is a double socket and it runs all the entire length. So we had 74 electric sockets and maybe 20 pieces of equipment maximum that we'd actually need to plug in. When we arrived, we found nails in most of the sockets and wires coming out, and that's what they would use to charge their mobile phones. So highly dangerous for us. None of them, a lot of them didn't have earths, which was rectified shortly after. But something we take for granted, such as charging a mobile phone, out there, I mean, they seized on this. It was gold to them, because they would normally have to take their mobile phone to a central charging station in the town, and there'd be colourful shacks that have 50 or 60 mobile phones just plugged in charging, because they were the only places that could afford the electricity or could afford a generator. So it rapidly became apparent that patience was really key. We had a lot of waiting around because the laboratory wasn't built yet. We had to have carpenters in to build all the benches. We hadn't got the equipment that we needed to start running diagnostics. So a fair few hours were spent doing exactly this, sat on the floor waiting. And there's nothing we could do about that. We had significant supply issues. Everything was flown in from the UK to Freetown. It was then held in a central storage facility and then trucked to our location. But this central storage facility wasn't exactly secure. We had a number of things that were stolen. Our molecular grade ethanol was a big problem. A lot of that was stolen. There's some people having a great time in Sierra Leone. So in the end, a lot of these required escort from the MOD. And the trucks would arrive, and of course they'd be packaged in reverse. So they'd arrive at our laboratory and everything would be on the bottom. So you'd have to unpack everything and then repack the truck. So really the logic was missing in some instances. None of our fridges arrived. To this day we still don't know where they went. They arrived in country and then disappeared. So one of my colleagues actually had to source a fridge from a bar in Freetown. So this is where the Ebola samples would be stored, and you can see it's a drinks fridge. Not the most ideal in the world, but we had no choice. We were under pressure to open the laboratory. The government had promised to start running diagnostics on or around the 1st of December. That had already passed. So really we needed to do whatever we could to get the equipment that we needed to actually run the diagnostic tests. And communications were awful. No matter how many mobile phones you had, no matter what make, no matter what network they were running on, you could never have more than a 5-minute conversation with someone without the network dropping out. So this is my colleague Bruno again, and all 4 of these phones are his. That's what he's needing to actually run the laboratory on a daily basis. So one of these will be dedicated to PHE, one will be to the NGO, one will be his personal one here, and another one will be a spare backup emergency one. On my second deployment, I had to carry 3 phones with me, and none really worked. But that's what you have to put up with. We really could have done with 2-way radios, but I'm not too sure they would have been much better. So we did what we could with what we had. We had no cleaning equipment, and we needed to get the laboratory relatively clean to start operations. It essentially was a building site. There was a lot of dust and a lot of debris around, and for any of you that's ever done any sort of molecular work, that's a big no-no. You've got to have a relatively clean environment to ensure that your tests are actually going to be accurate. Here's my colleague Katie sweeping the floor with a broom that she's made out of twigs held together by a bin bag. And here a couple of my colleagues washing the floor with river water with copious amounts of chlorine, because we had no way of measuring the chlorine, but we knew that adding it to river water it would quickly be consumed by organic material. But we made do with what we had, and it did work in the end. And this is what we turned the laboratory into. So this is an image of the fully functioning Ebola diagnostic laboratory. I'll just take you through a few features. This here is what we call a flexible film isolator. It's very similar to that small one that I showed you from the European Mobile Laboratory, but this is more of it's bigger, it's more of a permanent structure. It's on wheels, so you can wheel it wherever you like. It does have a car battery backup, so if the generator power were to die, it would switch to that backup to maintain it safely. What it does is it creates a negative pressure inside here, so that should you have any pathogen spillage, it should pull it out via the filters, via these HEPA filters at the top here, to make it safe. Again, it's creating that physical barrier between yourself and the sample. And that's where all the processing of live virus took place. Here we caught the tail end of a much bigger flexible film isolator. It's got 4 ports instead. You do a lot more work in there. At the end here, these 2 machines, this one here and this one here, are automated robots for extracting the genetic material from Ebola virus. And I'll touch on how those work in a bit. Down here we have an alternative power supply unit. There's another one hiding at the back here. So these are battery backups for some of the other electrical equipment that can't run off car batteries. So how did the whole diagnostic process work? Well, we would receive samples from 2 principal places. The first is the community. So these are samples coming in from community hospitals, community treatment centres that don't have diagnostic capability. They're coming from villages, they're coming from healthcare workers who are going out to try and hunt people who may have Ebola. And here we see a staff member from the community delivering samples to the reception area at Kerrytown. This was outside in the searing heat. It wasn't particularly pleasant. We got 2 of my colleagues here who had received the samples from this gentleman here and placed them immediately in 10,000 ppm chlorine. Now, the sample should arrive triply contained, so there should be no risk to any of our workers in handling the samples. But because the risk, it does exist, however small, they're immediately into 10,000 ppm chlorine to decontaminate the outside completely. Now, that's a really strong chlorine solution, deliberately so that we can be absolutely sure that it's doing the job. So when we first opened, we received samples principally through ambulance drivers who had arrived with 50, 60 samples at once. We didn't have a reception area like this, so we'd actually go out to meet the ambulance. We'd be dressed in more enhanced PPE, so we'd have a mask and a visor, an extra gown, gloves, and we'd spray the ambulance down as well with 10,000 ppm chlorine, just to ensure that no contamination was left in that ambulance before they went out again. You've got to remember that ambulance may well have had a positive patient in as well. They may not just be delivering samples. So this is where we received our samples at Port Loco. So it was essentially a small table outside the lab window. We'd receive into that bucket there that contained the chloride, and they'd be taken in the laboratory and then placed in those flexible film isolators. The other samples would come from the treatment unit that we're actually associated with. So in November, the treatment unit opened and we had about, I think, a total of 15 patients in there at the time, which was relatively few because they had a 100-bed capacity. But when you're opening these places, you open them up in drips and drabs because of the amount of effort, amount of work required to deal with just a few Ebola patients, because you're only allowed in the red zone in patient contact for a maximum of 45 minutes. You can probably only see 1 or 2 patients each time you enter, and then you've got to come out and have a good 2-hour rest or so. So it's a strain on staff resources, particularly when you only have maybe 10 doctors and nurses. So soon you deplete the amount of people that can actually be in there, and you've got to go in pairs or threes. So we'd receive samples from the treatment centre maybe every other day for each patient to monitor how they were doing. Our purpose there, of course, was not only to diagnose patients but also to ensure that they were Ebola free so they could be discharged. And typically that would be a negative test followed by 2 days followed by another negative test, and then they would be safe to release back into the community. However, it wasn't all plain sailing. This is an example of a delivery that was taken at the Kerrytown laboratory by one of my colleagues when they first set out. You can see that several blood tubes, none of which are contained in themselves. They're all in the same bag. Several have smashed. And you've essentially got a pool of blood down here, which is undoubtedly Ebola virus positive. How much Ebola virus? Well, in some cases we were seeing maybe 10 billion copies per milliliter of blood. So very, very high viral loads, highly infectious material. So they were going nowhere near this. This unfortunately contains, 15 people's samples, and they would all have to be retested. They'd have to go get more samples and deliver them to the laboratory possible, because the infection risk from this to our staff is just too great. We simply cannot handle it. This prompted PHE to start a formal training program to educate the healthcare workers, many of whom weren't healthcare workers before Ebola struck. They were essentially just thrust into the job, took any job they could get. So they weren't trained in how to properly package samples. So we worked closely with those people to train them, tell them the tube had to be contained within another plastic tube, within a bag that was sealed correctly, with the correct accompanying paperwork, which was always a bit of an issue. We had a requirement to match samples to paperwork to make sure that we were giving the right person the right diagnosis. We were hampered by the fact that there's probably only 6, 7 or 8 common surnames in Sierra Leone. So there'd be a lot of people with the same name, so you'd rely on patient number, and that may not also be correct. We had an incident where one woman had her blood taken, it was tested, it was determined to be negative, so she was given a certificate. When you have a negative result, you're given a certificate so you can show to other people to say that you're actually free of Ebola. It later transpired that there was a paperwork mix-up and she was in fact positive, so they then had to go back out to the community, retrieve her from the community, bring her to the treatment centre, of course causing great distress to her, put her into the treatment centre with other positive patients, took another test and she came back negative. And the initial diagnosis was in fact correct, but because she'd then been put in the treatment unit in close proximity with other positive patients, she had to remain there until she was clear again. 21 days. And that wasn't an infrequent occurrence. There were a number of paperwork mix-ups. And again, it's kind of understandable because literacy rate isn't great. So the people writing these forms may not be able to write, so they just do their best. And that's all they were trying to do. They were doing what they thought was best. And by and large, they did a fantastic job. But there were a few mix-ups which led to a few unfortunate incidents. So, as I said, we would receive samples from the community or the Ebola treatment centres. The first step after decontaminating the outside of the samples would be to what we call inactivate the virus. So that's essentially killing the virus. That's the first step. So we've got a highly infectious sample. We want to make it non-infectious as quickly as possible. So it's passed into this flexible film isolator via this pass box here. So you open the outer door. You never open both at the same time for obvious reasons. You place the samples in here, you take them in, and you open the blood tubes and you take off a small portion of blood. You then add what we call a lysis reagent to the blood, which essentially breaks open the virus. It destroys the virus. It releases the genetic material inside the virus, making it no longer infectious. There were 2 treatment steps to ensure that this did actually happen, to reassure ourselves. So there was one lysis step and then there was another lysis step with another reagent, just to be doubly sure that when we took them out of here for processing, they were in fact dead. So they'd be taken to these robots here, which is designed to extract the genetic material. Ebola is an RNA virus, and to do PCR, we typically want DNA. So we can extract the RNA using these robots. It's all automated, so it's got good reproducibility, it's got good throughput. It takes about 45 minutes to do 14 samples. And they come out the other side essentially as RNA. So we've taken that virus, we've split it open, and we've just taken its genetic material. And all we've got in that tube is its purified genetic material. So we then run a PCR. It's a quantitative PCR, so we can tell precisely how much virus is in the sample. And we do that in dedicated side rooms. So if you remember my first picture of the original laboratory, there were a few open doors. Well, these were separate rooms where we'd have cabinets like this, which are essentially an ultra-clean environment within which we could run our PCR. when we first opened, we hadn't taken delivery of any of these cabinets, so we were performing the PCR on the open bench, which is usually a big no-no. We had significant concerns about doing so, but miraculously it worked. I'm very surprised, and within about a week we had taken delivery of these. So we will prepare the mix in here, so we'd mix the viral RNA with several enzymes and reagents that allow us to change the RNA into DNA, and then we can amplify the DNA. So PCR works by detecting a very small fragment of the Ebola genome and amplifying that to detectable levels. And by comparing the signal of an unknown sample to a signal of a known sample, you can work out precisely how much was in the original sample. So we could do that within the turnaround time of approximately 4 to 6 hours. Now that's a significant improvement, because before we arrived, it would take maybe 24 to 48 hours to get a result, simply because there were fewer laboratories and samples had to travel hundreds of miles to those laboratories. So it wasn't infrequent to get samples that were taken on a Monday and you get them in the lab on a Sunday. And that's far too long to do an accurate diagnosis, so those had to be turned away. The 3 laboratories quadrupled the testing capability in Sierra Leone, and by the end of March this year, we represented more than a third of the total testing capability in Sierra Leone, just through Public Health England. There were other laboratories from other countries. We had the Dutch, we had the Chinese, we had the South Africans, we had Russians, and we had the CDC from Atlanta, who formed a big laboratory in Bo, which is one of the main cities. Interestingly, the Americans do things slightly different to us, and they had people in full biohazard level 4 suits, so they could do everything on the open bench. That wasn't practical for us. Currently in the UK, in our biosafety level 4 laboratories, we've got one at Porton. We work in what's called cabinet lines, so they're very similar to these kind of isolators here, but they're permanent structures, they're not flexible. And we can work in the laboratory in gear like this, so we don't require a full airline fed suit like you'd see on films such as Outbreak or things like that, because all the samples remain inside here and never come out of these cabinets. It's a bit restrictive, but it's how we work in the UK. The Americans do things slightly differently, so they had a laboratory that was equipped with people in full suits, which must have been quite unbearable at times. So I think it really was a fantastic effort by the first team. We arrived on the 23rd of November. We had the lab live by the 5th of December. And within about a 3.5 week diagnostic period, we tested 700 patient samples, so approximately 43 per day. And we performed over 1,000 individual diagnostic tests on those samples. And we only really had one minor lab problem, which was the Army forgot to refuel our generator. So we'd just taken delivery of all our PCR reagents, approximately £25,000 worth, and it all defrosted overnight. And it can only have one defrost. So that was a big waste of money. But hey-ho, you live with these things. This is my team here. Fantastic effort by all of them. So my second deployment, I volunteered to lead a team in July and August 2015 to the Kerrytown laboratory. For my sins, it was in fact rainy season. So not the end of rainy season, this was properly rainy season. I'll just show you a video of what it's like. This here is concrete and it's under about 3 inches of water. This here is about 2 feet deep, and it rained continuously for 15 days. So each day we had to wade through this to our rooms. Now we were in a bit better accommodation this time because it was actually a luxury 5-star resort, believe it or not. There are some in Sierra Leone because there was a tourism trade before Ebola struck. And this is based on that western peninsula near Freetown, near the Kerrytown laboratory. It's a very nice site. It's right on the beach. It's a very beautiful location. But boy, did it rain. So the Kerrytown Ebola Treatment Centre was renamed Kerry Town Treatment Unit, or KTTU, and that's because the Ebola Treatment Centre had actually closed by the time I'd gone out for the second time. Save the Children, who ran the site, had left, and the Australian company Aspen Medical had taken over, and they were responsible for providing care for healthcare workers. And that was not only expats but national staff as well, which was refreshing to see, because until that point there really hadn't been a dedicated facility for national staff members, and national healthcare workers were at greatest risk of acquiring Ebola. And hundreds died. Sierra Leone lost half of their doctors when Ebola struck, and that left them with maybe one doctor per 100,000 people. So the healthcare system really took a battering. Up until the point that I arrived, the treatment unit had treated 130 patients. Not all of them had had Ebola, because the beauty of this site is that we inherited from the MOD a whole host of other diagnostic potentials. So we could run biochemistry testing, we could run hematology, so blood counts, and we could test for over 100 different infectious diseases. Because most of the people working here, they're at low risk of acquiring Ebola, certainly Western healthcare workers, and they're at greater risk of acquiring far more common enteric pathogens such as E. coli. And because that has the capability of giving you a fever, you've got to work out quite quickly that they don't have Ebola and they have E. coli, so they don't need to be admitted to the treatment unit. One of the biggest things that we had was malaria. It was vital to discriminate malaria from Ebola, because malaria is very common in West Africa. It's estimated that every 3 years an individual has malaria in West Africa. So a huge burden, and it can present very similar to the early stages of Ebola. So being able to discriminate someone with malaria very early on means that you can get them out the treatment unit so they're not at risk from contact with other patients. Being able to diagnose someone with Ebola means you can isolate them very quickly, so the risk to other patients is much lower. You can prevent the further spread of disease. And the malaria testing we had could be conducted in approximately 10 minutes. So you could get a very fast malaria result if they were positive. We still had to carry out the Ebola test because a number of people had co-infections. And it appears possibly that malaria could predispose you to a more severe Ebola infection. Although that's not proven at this time, we had approximately 20% of people who had Ebola also had malaria. So in my time here, we had cases of Ebola. We had 2 very interesting cases of Ebola. 2 national healthcare workers, 2 nurses who were the same age. They had no underlying health conditions whatsoever. One had very severe disease and one had very mild disease. In fact, he was almost asymptomatic, although he was indeed positive with Ebola. So they were 2 very interesting comparisons. We had several cases of malaria. We had Shigella, which is a particularly nasty enteric pathogen, gives you very nasty diarrhea, give you a fever, can lead to kidney problems. We had Vibrio in several Western healthcare workers, probably from eating dodgy seafood. They should have known better. And a couple cases of E. coli, including myself. And influenza, interestingly enough. So there's a lot of influenza A circulating in West Africa, particularly in the capital Freetown, where there's dense population. And I got to see my first survivor ceremony, which was very nice, because the first time I deployed, we'd had 15 or so patients, 12 of whom had died by the time I left. On the very last day of leaving the first time round, we were able to actually tell someone that they were Ebola free, and that they'd been treated successfully, which was very rewarding and a very nice end. But all the people that deployed after got to see several survivor ceremonies, and it's actually quite a big thing. So the national staff will come out, they'll sing a song, they'll dance about, there's a bit of a celebration, and all the survivors will add their handprint to a wall, or in this case it's a new sheet of plaster that's going to go up on the wall. But a very emotional event to finally see a survivor. So something good to actually come out of this at last. You can see he's particularly happy as well. And this is the guy that was very asymptomatic. He was a nurse, and for a long time we were baffled as to how he actually became infected. He had performed a procedure on a woman who'd had postpartum hemorrhage. It was deemed to be a high-risk procedure, and that woman later tested positive for Ebola. So it was assumed that he got it from that woman. But he actually fell ill, I think, on almost day 30, which is beyond the normal incubation period. So we didn't quite believe that he had caught it from that woman. And what we were able to later show through sequencing the Ebola genome, which I'll touch on a bit later, is that actually he caught it from a woman whilst he was in isolation. So he'd been put into an isolation ward because he'd had a known exposure. And whilst he was there, someone else had come down with Ebola, and it appears that he had simply shared the same sink with that woman and been contaminated from that woman in isolation, which shouldn't have happened. There should have been procedures in place. It wasn't a Western healthcare facility that he was admitted to, it was a national staff one. So really it was another fantastic team. Some of these guys are Brits, but most are Australians. They were very knowledgeable, probably the best team that I've ever worked with. And what struck me about going the second time round is that Sierra Leone seemed alive again. When we were there originally, there were curfews, there were bans on sporting events, there were bans on mass gatherings, so you couldn't hold your markets. You couldn't do anything that involved more than 5 or 10 people gathering in a place. You had to be in your homes at night. So really the place was absence of all forms of life. You could see a few people wandering the street, but it was very eerie. Now, the second time around, the curfew had been lifted. The number of cases had dropped significantly. We were able to interact with the locals. This was taken wandering into town. They were all very cheerful. The kids were very intrigued by white people. Probably never seen this before. We were able to attend the local football matches. Again, this is me attracting a lot of attention from children. But this was in stark contrast to things still going on in Guinea. This is a picture that I borrowed from my colleague Didier, whose convoy was attacked in Guinea. And some of you may have read about it. Several healthcare workers were actually killed in Guinea in the early stages of the outbreak because there was a lot of resentment from locals who didn't believe that Ebola was real. There was a lot of people who believed it was made up as an excuse for Western healthcare workers to come in and perform experiments and things like that. This largely did not happen in Sierra Leone. The people were generally very welcoming. They knew what we were there to do. They would go out of their way to make us feel comfortable, which was great. But in Guinea, which is only across the border, things were very different. Fortunately, we didn't have to deal with scenes like this, but unfortunately my colleague did. So I just want to touch on something that really was a game changer when I was out there for the second time. And that's PHE introduced the capability to sequence Ebola in real time. So that's looking at the whole genetic code of Ebola. So with the PCR we look at a very small amount, but with the whole genome sequencing we look at the whole sequence, whole of the genetic material of Ebola. And that's brilliant because it can help elucidate transmission chains in real time. So you can see how the virus is spreading between people so that you can intervene to stop it. It's a great tool for epidemiologists on the ground. But it also enables us to monitor for changes in the virus genome that may affect the sensitivity of our diagnostics. So our PCR targets a very small amount of DNA. If a change happened in that DNA, our diagnostic might not be as great. So we can look for changes and then change the diagnostics as appropriate, or indeed the treatment options. So this is a guy called Ian Goodfellow, who worked in collaboration with PHE. He's from Cambridge and the Sanger Sequencing Institute. Here is the sequencing machine, and here is a preparation machine here, and it's essentially set up in a tent in the middle of one of the treatment sites. You'd never dream of doing this in the UK. And they often joked, but I'm sure it was real, it was the most expensive tent in West Africa. Several £100,000 worth of equipment, and it worked brilliantly. So they're able to sequence a number of viral genomes and help us to determine where that healthcare worker got his infection from. So a really good, valuable source to have. and there's a whole host of information that they can now gather from these sequences that they're building up to look at Ebola in a lot more depth, because although it's been a tragic event, it's enabled a lot of data to be collected that can now be mined for very valuable information to prevent these things from happening in the future, give us a better understanding of what Ebola is, where it survives, and how we may combat it in the future. So talking about the future, what does it actually hold? Well, PHE are committed to maintaining a legacy in Sierra Leone. We have currently transferred most of the diagnostic equipment to regional hospital laboratories in Sierra Leone. We will support them in establishing their own diagnostic capability. We will train their own staff. Of course, a number of their staff are unfortunately now dead. Those that dealt with Lassa fever, which is it's a similar disease to Ebola and is endemic in West Africa. There were a number of diagnostic laboratories for that. Unfortunately, when Ebola struck, they received Ebola samples, and a lot of them died during the course of doing their work. So there was a gap left in the skill of local workers. So we're committed to training people appropriately, to providing the logistical support to at least 2 diagnostic centres in Sierra Leone. And that will significantly increase the capability that even they had before Ebola struck. We'll also provide guidance, and I'm sure Department for International Development has pledged a lot of money for a number of years going forward. So hopefully we'll be able to transfer what was a failing healthcare system even before Ebola into something a lot more robust that can deal with not only Ebola, but principally malaria on a daily basis and other infectious diseases. You may have read a number of articles that have come out recently on so-called post-Ebola syndrome. And this is essentially complaints from survivors of various problems, typically joint pain. We know that Ebola was isolated from the eye of an American doctor. We know that Pauline Kafke had meningitis from Ebola. When it came back, it was essentially residing in her brain, or we think it was residing in her brain. In what we call an immune privileged site, so it's hiding from the immune system. We know it survives in semen. I'm sure there are other areas in the body where it survives as well. So I think in the future we are going to see a number of other cases crop up in West Africa over the next few years. They may cause small outbreaks, 3 or 4 cases, particularly through sexual transmission. We've seen in Liberia recently, twice Liberia has been declared Ebola free, and then there's been a few more cases after that. Don't quite know how that's occurred yet, but I'm sure they're working on it. So I think for the future we're going to see a number of cases in West Africa. It's not going to go away completely, and that poses a bit of a problem, because how do you ramp down the Ebola response whilst at the same time maintaining the capability of responding to a large flare-up if it were to happen? And I'd just like to finish by saying that Sierra Leone really is actually a beautiful country. It's got a marvellous coastline. It's a fantastic Riviera. It did have a tourism industry in the 60s and the 70s and a little bit before Ebola struck, but it's got huge potential. Really is a beautiful country, and I would encourage anybody to visit once Ebola is out of the way. You may see scenes like this. And that was where we were staying on the beach. So in comparison to camping, it was luxury. So I'd just like to thank all the people on this slide, all those that responded as part of the international effort in West Africa, because everybody did a fantastic job. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sam, for an absolutely fascinating presentation. As I said earlier, I really take my hat off to you. I wouldn't have had the courage to do that, and I really think all you and your colleagues are really to be admired. And are you happy to take questions?
I am, yes. Yeah.
Right, any questions from the audience, please?
Two questions, if I may. The first one is with regard to the water from the borehole. Could you not chemically treat it? And I'll give you the second one straight away, and then
Yep.
you can. Yeah. The second one is when you come to breaking down the wall of the protein wall of the virus. Were you using enzymes, or were you using some other to release the RNA?
It's essentially a surfactant-based lysis reagent. the makeup of which is proprietary.
Right.
But a lot of validation had been carried out prior by other organisations prior to Ebola outbreak on the validation of whether it actually was effective or not. So we had, the assurance that what we were doing was actually accurate. In terms of the borehole, I'm sure that would have been an option if we could get the chemicals. Yeah.
Knowing what you know now, if you were to go back, what would you do differently? And if something like this was to happen again, how would you advise that things should be handled differently?
Ooh. Well, for a start, as is well publicised, the response to this outbreak was far too slow. In the future, we need to be able to respond more rapidly, and Public Health England are actively engaged in forming a workforce of people that can deploy at very short notice to anything like this that happens again. What would I do differently when I was out there? I would maintain better hand hygiene. The second time around, because we were in slightly better accommodation, it was, I think I was a bit lax in my hand hygiene, and then I became ill. Whereas the first time round camping in what looked like worse conditions, I was absolutely fine, but my hand hygiene was much more rigorous. I don't think there's much else that I would do different. It was second time round was a lot easier because I'd been there before. First time round was much more of a culture shock. In some regards, coming back here is the most difficult bit. When we came back originally, we actually got back on Christmas Day, which was an experience, and we'd been in a country where they don't have anything. They hadn't been able to celebrate Christmas. Christmas was banned. And coming back here to all the joy and all the presents, everything, it was a cultural overload. In terms of out there, there's nothing I regret, there's nothing I would change. I think it all went as well as it could.
Three outbreaks in 3 different countries with different responses in each. Is it possible to look at the way the outbreaks were responded to in those countries and get any lessons on which systems work best?
I'm sure it is. Yes, you're right. There were 3 distinct responses. The coordination could have been better. I think we need a unified approach. We need, particularly for things like diagnostics, we should all be using the same diagnostics so we can compare results between laboratories. We developed our own. We started off with one assay, then we moved to one that we developed in-house that was more stable. One of the biggest issues is cold chain. That really needs to be thought about in the future. How do you get reagents out and maintain them at -20? It's almost impossible. I think what hampered it, in my opinion, is that a lot of non-government organisations working independently, doing their own things. It wasn't an integrated effort in any of the countries, in my opinion. But I think WHO have learnt from that. They've received quite a bit of criticism. So I'm sure they're making headway in establishing a more robust response that can be initiated in the future. Other than that, it's not my area of expertise, I'm afraid. But it's a decision above my pay grade.
Yes, David.
Could I ask you about the progress regarding the success or failure of the current antiviral treatments? I was told that Gilead now have a good vaccine. I believe it was used on Nurse Kafeki with some success. But I know nothing about this, so I'd like your view.
There are a number of vaccines, I think 3 different vaccines in development currently, one of which shows very good efficacy, and that's one of which the PHE is supporting currently in Guinea, and that was a vaccination of healthcare workers, none of whom became ill. That may have happened anyway, we don't know. That looks like the most promising vaccine at the moment. With regards to antiviral treatments, there's a number on the market. Well, not really on the market. There's several that people are using In the UK, there were several used on the healthcare workers that were brought back. One mystery Chinese drug, and a few others. I don't know the current status of those. I only know the vaccine that PHE is involved in that's showing very good results currently in Guinea. And I'm sure that will be taken forward by, I think it's Glaxo. But the promise is there. I think they have a product that's good enough to protect people, to ring fence people, to stop Ebola from spreading. If you can vaccinate contacts quickly, then you can probably prevent it from spreading out. So I'd be surprised if Ebola happened on this scale again, because we're armed with a better response and better treatment options to prevent spread.
Can I just ask a question? Are bats the main reservoir of this disease?
They are a reservoir. We don't know if they are the main reservoir, and there's no real evidence to suggest transmission between bats and humans. It's kind of a missing link. Certainly it's been isolated in other things as well. But I would have thought in this outbreak it probably was migratory bats, because Ebola is not typically seen in that region of West Africa. It's more down towards the Congo, where it's obviously named after. So it's probably a migration of bats. But to be honest, we don't know. It could be in other regions of Africa because we just haven't tested. But certainly bats are the main suspect. Yeah.
Right, any final questions from anybody?
Hi, Sam. It just occurs to me that everything that you did and everyone else or your colleagues out in Ceylon probably seems like a dark art to many of the people that live out there. So you talk about prevention. How much is being done about educating people about how this virus is transmitted, and maybe the more simple, relatively pragmatic steps that can be taken to prevent the spread of infection rather than firefighting through molecular biology techniques?
Yeah. So I think you're hinting there, prevention is better than cure. There was an enormous drive at educating people whilst we were there, but more so after the fact. So the NGOs took the lead on that in cooperation with WHO epidemiologists. They would go out, they would visit communities, they would educate people. A lot of the education occurred at places such as mother and baby clinics. So the plan is there. I think gradually Sierra Leone is learning. Certainly when they banned the traditional funeral practices, they saw a dramatic decline in cases. And largely the people of Sierra Leone were very receptive. They knew that changing that practice, although they didn't want to do it, I mean, it's their tradition. And in some regards you have to respect that. But they realised that it was a bad thing, and that by changing their practices, changing their burial practices, they were actually limiting the spread. So I saw very positive reception to the training programs that we're carrying on. Of course, you're hampered by very remote communities. There's a very tribal culture, which, may predominate any other way of thinking. So I think there's certainly a lot of work to be done. As for the other countries, I don't know because I wasn't there. But there is a strong emphasis on prevention in the future.
Right. One last question, or are we done? Two questions. Sorry.
So you've got sort of greater than postdoc education. How much of what you did day to day required that, or was it? I know from some of the medics out there, the doctors were doing what day to day were doing sort of nurse type roles.
I would say none. There were plenty of people I served with that were educated, but they were postgraduates, but they hadn't received any education beyond that. They'd gone straight into a job. You just needed a sound understanding of the techniques and how to apply them. And I said everybody went through the same sort of training. And we had a diverse workforce, not from just within PHE, but from within academia, within the NHS. So my PhD, pretty much irrelevant when we got out there. Everybody was singing off the same hymn sheet. They'd all been trained to the same standards. So and it was great to see, actually, because there were, you have people who were relatively low staff elevated to quite a degree of responsibility, and they'd step up really well. So it was great for their development.
That was really great. Thanks for such an interesting, amazing talk. Do you mind if I ask you one question? The camp, do you think, having been there, say, twice in Sierra Leone, that you would plan the camp any differently? Because I read about one camp, say, that was set up in China to help some epidemic, and the water supply fell down, so they had to plan it another way. Now it could be treated as a joke, but at the time it wasn't really very funny. And thank you for listening.
What I would have liked is permanent toilets, a bit quicker. Generally, the camp was excellent because it was built by well-trained staff who were used to building camps in disaster areas. In fact, prior to coming to Sierra Leone, they'd actually worked in Syria. So they were well versed. Other than the issues we had with water supply, which was a little tricky, there wasn't much else we would have changed. Maybe not putting it in the location where it became a quagmire very easily, and we had to dig quite extensive trenching across the campsite. But I don't think any of us really predicted that the weather would be that bad. But no, in general, a lot of praise for the guys that built the camp. Thank you.